From awaytogarden.com and robinhoodradio.com, this is A Way to Garden with Margaret Roach, your weekly invitation to dig in and grow.
Maybe you, like I do, have certain perennial beds that could use editing and some particular plants that need dividing in the process. That's just one focus of today's guest, Toshi Yano, in his role as Director of Horticulture at Wethersfield, a former private estate turned public garden in the Hudson Valley of New York. And he'll tell us the how-to and also about visiting this special place. More in a moment, but first, this message.
Underwriting support by Color Blends Wholesale Flower Bulbs, supplying landscape professionals and ambitious residential gardeners with new ideas and high-quality flower bulbs for fall planting. Plant tulips, plant daffodils, plant Color Blends this fall. Available at colorblends.com.
Toshi Yano is in his third year as Director of Horticulture at the former estate called Wethersfield Garden in Dutchess County, New York, with its 3-acre formal gardens plus 7 acres of wilderness garden and commanding views of the Catskills and Berkshire mountains. Toshi and his team are bringing the gardens back to life, and he's here to tell us about the place and specifically about the tasks of editing and dividing that every perennial gardener needs to do, whatever their garden scale. Hi, Toshi. How are you?
Hi, Margaret. I'm great. I'm so happy to be talking to you.
Yeah. Busy.
Yes.
Yeah.
We finally have some sun. It's been such a rainy, wet, cool year.
Yeah. So can we start with just a quick couple, little intro to Wethersfield? It's wethersfield.org, WETHERSFIELD, not like the weather.org, the website, and just a little bit about what is this place?
Sure. So Wethersfield is the former estate of a man named Chauncey Stillman. He was a gentleman farmer, a student of architecture, and a patron of classical arts. Wethersfield was sort of his experimental laboratory where he got to introduce lots of new farming techniques. He had started the estate after the Dust Bowl and brought over a Kansan farmer, and they introduced a lot of new soil and water management techniques. And at the same time, he created a very unique garden. He was sort of the last entry to the country place era gardens, post-income tax and minimum wage. A lot of these great estate gardens sort of fell by the wayside. Mr. Stillman was the grandson of the person who had founded Citibank, so finances weren't really an issue for him. And he created this very intricate, formal garden at the top of a hill. And he and his friends, who were all sort of classical scholars, really went to extremes to recreate an Italian Renaissance garden full of formal hedging, topiary, and in addition, a woodland bosco garden full of statuary telling an allegory of a descent into the afterlife and an ascent out of it into paradise, basically. So it's a very unique garden in a lot of ways that takes most of its cues from the Italian Renaissance in a way that no other garden, I think, in America does, with as much fidelity.
Right. So you arrived 3 seasons ago, approximately, at this place, and in the formal Italian tradition, and it's big, and it's got all kinds of elements that need loving care and so forth. Lots of beds and borders. What's the palette of plants like, especially in the borders? I mean, I understand there are like pleached hedges and, like you said, like topiary and all kinds of things in the woody world to give it structure. But what's kind of the palette or the signatures of some of these beds and borders that you discovered when you came?
Right. So around the house, Mr. Stillman, when he had first bought the estate, had designed an arts and crafts garden. So there are a number of garden rooms immediately adjacent to the house that sort of harken back to the days of Lutyens and Jekyll. And so they're filled with flower beds. And when I got there, we had sort of spring planting of irises and peonies, and then sort of late summer plantings of phlox and monkshood and Japanese anemone. And that was sort of it. You know, there was nothing midsummer. And, of course, we're open from the beginning of June to the end of September. So all around the house and in our cutting garden beds, we sort of had an empty space where nothing was really blooming. And that was sort of one of the first things that I wanted to address. We have we have a great archive with all the drawings and planting plans from about 1950 through somewhere in the 80s. And so I was able to go through and see sort of what had been here and what had been lost and work from the plantings, the historical plantings, and sort of adjust them a little bit to contemporize them. And that's sort of where we are now in the middle of addressing all those issues.
Okay. So big garden or small garden, my garden. When will you be here, Toshi, to help me? Oh, my goodness. Anyway,
if I ever find another, my garden is just doing, it's a meadow, more or less, shade meadow.
Yeah.
And so, that's about all I have time for outside of here.
So, you know, where to begin, that's always the thing. And to avoid paralysis of not doing anything. So, you know, plants grow. And so the way when we planted a bed, you know, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or in my case, in some cases, 20 or 30 years ago, or what you've inherited, you know, a bed of mixed perennials or perennials and shrubs, what it looked like at the time when it first grew in and what it looks like ... years down the road, not the same. And the proportions have shifted and whatever. So I assume that that's when you want to apply that eye for editing and sort of how do we get in the editing mindset? So, you know, and people listening are not looking at the scale you're looking at, but smaller. And so what do? We stand back, we take some notes. What do we do?
Yeah, so, you know, for me here, I just watched the garden for about a year before I decided to make any kind of decision. And I guess, you know, where are the gaps in bloom time when we're looking at beds and borders? How can we address those? What kind of plants can we bring in to sort of fill in those spaces? So the first year I started to edit, it was more about dividing the stuff that had been left to sort of roam for, you know, decades. So mostly that was phlox and monkshood and anemone. And so I did a lot of division and transplanting of those so that, you know, instead of huge swaths of those plants, we had sort of pockets. And I started to grow perennials to fill in those spaces and then planted those out and sort of waited till the next season to see how everything responded. You know, it's a long process, especially in a garden this scale. But even at home, you know, it's not something we want to say, oh, I've done the division and that's it. We're done. I've transplanted. You know, we have to keep watching, of course, and making sure that things are sort of moving according to whatever plan we have.
And what you just said is first looking for instance, the gaps in the bloom time, and writing that down and keeping that front of mind is a really great guiding principle. So I think one of the, besides their above ground beauty, one of the other sort of interesting things, fascinating things about all the plants we call perennials, you know, they're not just different above ground, they're different below ground too. They don't have all the same root structure. And I assume that, you know, because you have a lot more expertise, you're trained in this, et cetera, you kind of know what you're going to be up against. But are there kind of plants that you would or wouldn't disturb in the spring or fall, or that, you know, you just said, for instance, the phlox, you decided, hey, I'm going to, you know, it's taken up too much territory. Like, how do you then make a sort of a schedule based on what the plants are?
So in a lot of cases I do. You know, I mentioned that we had irises and peonies for the spring, and those needed to be divided and moved, but they are not happy to be divided or moved in the spring. We wait, in the case of irises, with their sort of rhizomatous structure, till July or August traditionally to divide them, and the peonies, into usually in fall, early fall, September, to divide those, and it's because, as you said, their sort of underground structure. They require a different sort of division than something like phlox, which can really be divided almost any time. Although, because of all the work we're doing with annuals as well here and planting those out, I tend to wait till fall to do most of my divisions and not do them in the spring.
Right.
The root structure will tell you a lot about how to divide something. The sort of more woody, rooted plants usually require like a garden knife, as opposed to the more fibrous rooted plants, which require forks, garden forks, or hand. The plants tell us a lot, and I think if you've not done it before, it's always good to get a sense of what you're dealing with, either looking on the internet, which is always a helpful reference, or my favorite place to go, and it was always recommended to me when I was in school, is this. You can find it almost anywhere in any used bookstore or on the internet, is the Reader's Digest Illustrated Guide to Gardening. And I keep it at hand. It's it went through so many editions and was a Bible for so many generations of gardeners. And even at the New York Botanic Garden, which is where I did the horticulture portion of my degree, the old school gardeners there, who will know more about gardening than I ever will, swear by it. So that's a great reference. Yeah, I think the Reader's Digest, they had T.H. Everett, who was the director at the New York Botanic Garden, do his encyclopedia, like a shortened version, I believe, for Reader's Digest. So they had great authors and great editors, and they always kept up to date until they stopped publishing. And then another great book is the Well-Tended Perennial Garden by Tracy D. Sabato-Oust.
It is great, yes. And that's more contemporary, yes. A little bit more.
That is more contemporary, yes. Yeah. And has really sort of plant-by-plant recommendations for maintenance, division, when to divide, how to divide. And so, obviously, I'm sure you get tons of questions, when to divide this, when to divide that. And, the internet is sort of a murky place where if you go on, you're looking for a specific recommendation, you get 100 different recommendations and you don't know where to go. So those two books I recommend a lot.
Oh, great. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, in some of the old style books, you see, I'm visualizing out of memory, you'll see a picture, you said something about a garden fork, and you'll see two garden forks back to back, stuck into, their prongs stuck into a big clump of something, hostas. And then the idea of like pulling the handles of those two forks apart so that you're prying the root mass apart. Do you know what I mean? That sort of old,
Yes. Well, that's the diagram that I always think of when I'm doing those divisions. That's how I was taught to do the more fibrous rooted stuff. Yeah, put those forks back to back, and then move them, wiggle them more or less. Pry them up, pry that root ball apart.
Right.
And then you have instead of one plant, you have two plants now.
Yeah. And when all else fails, there's I have a bread knife, an old, large bread knife, serrated knife, heavy duty serrated knife from a million years ago, and that's in my garden basket. My basket. There's always that.
Sure. Hands are great. One of the things that my girlfriend is a director of horticulture at a public garden called Locust Grove, and when she brings plants home to our home garden, from the nursery, she'll take like a quart-size plant and turn it into 4 or 5 plants just using her hands, which is a great lesson she learned when she was an intern at Wave Hill from the gardener there, Harnack.
Yes.
And so that's a great home garden technique, is just sort of dividing plants that you buy from the nursery in small containers and turning them into, 3, 4, 5 new plants. So there are all kinds of different techniques, serrated bread knives, garden forks, and of course the garden forks aren't. I mentioned we have so much Japanese anemone here. That's not a great tool for dividing Japanese anemone, which are have those massive woody roots and resent transplanting. So when you have something like that, that's when the garden knife, or maybe the serrated bread knife, comes out. I try to keep my cuts as clean as possible when I'm dealing with that stuff, because not only do they resent transplanting, but they resent root disturbance. So
I had a friend who wanted to divide years ago a border of ornamental grasses, and he used to chainsaw to divide those root masses.
I've heard of people doing that, and successfully. So, I think whatever it takes, and those grasses, those ornamental grasses, after 4 or 5 years, they'll often get that sort of dead, hollow center. That is a great sign that you need to divide. And those roots are impossible to get through. So, I've heard of people. Well, chainsaw. This is the first time I've heard of chainsaw, but saws, hand saws. I've heard of people using.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So what we're trying to say to people is, lift it out of the ground and look at it and do a little homework. You named 2 vintage wonderful books, and there are other probably resources. I'll try to find some links, and I'll give links to those books with the transcript of the show. But look at it, and if it has like the roots of a hosta look very different from the roots of a daylily, which look very different from the roots of a coreopsis, which look very different from the roots of, look at it and in the way that, and this is going to sound completely nuts, but it won't be the first time I sounded completely nuts. If you ever had a necklace in your jewelry jar or box or whatever, and it got tangled up, you have to look carefully to figure out how to take it, to untangle it. And it's the same thing with roots of perennials. You've got to look. And sometimes I wash things. Do you know what I mean? I wash them first when they're out of the ground, and I really look.
Sure.
Which washing, I don't know about you, but if there's weeds in the bed that I'm doing, if I always wash things before I move them to a new bed, if there's bad weeds in anything.
Yeah, it's a great move, and I'd like to, if I have time, and sometimes it's just a mad scramble to get as much done as possible. So it is a great idea, especially like you said, if you have weeds. But to get a really great look at those roots, because the roots will tell you almost everything you need to know about how to divide the plant, as you're saying.
So we might then start with our, analysis, look for the gaps in our bloom time, look also for the things that have taken up too much territory, and we might tackle those two ideas sort of in unison, in the sense of, I'm going to make some room because the phlox has taken up too much. I'm going to reduce the phlox, and I'm going to think about what to put in that's going to be a different time from the phlox or my irises and peonies and so forth. And any other sort of hints or aftercare ideas, or anything else about the sort of transplanting, dividing, and the rest of the process?
Well, of course, when you do make those divisions, and you if you're going to reuse those plants in another part of the garden, or you're going to want to water in a ton as soon as those plants have been transplanted. So, obviously, nothing likes to be pulled out of where it's living and then moved somewhere else without, tons of care. So, you're going to want to, at the very minimum, water in your plants and watch them regularly to make sure that they're still alive. I think. Sorry, what was that?
No, and I think that's what you said before about that fall has become the primary time that you're doing this. That's what's great about fall also, is that some of the watering in, once you do it in the early going, fall and winter in many climates like ours in the Northeast, for instance, or a lot of the northern United States, will help you with that. Keep it moisture until spring while it's in that rooting in period.
That's right.
As opposed
to
doing it in July 1st.
Yes, yeah, and I try to avoid transplanting in the summer as much as possible for obvious reasons. Here, we've been going through a lot of drought. Except this year we haven't. But come July, the rain, if it comes in 20th of inches as opposed to the inches that we want. So one great thing about plants and transplanting them in the fall too is they'll keep sort of rooting until the ground freezes, and the ground freezes much later than one would tend to think.
Yes.
Here, so at some of my previous jobs, we bulbed until Thanksgiving and transplanted and all that kind of stuff. And for the most part, plants come out fairly well. The next season, next spring. So.
In the last couple of minutes, I wanted to hear, you've had, with the coronavirus lockdowns and people wanting to get out. And last year you had a big uptick in visitorship, didn't you? At Wethersfield.
We did. Yes. We had seen, a couple thousand visitors per year, in normal times. And last year people were so eager to get out of their house. And we were open to the public. We opened for free because we didn't, want to have any contact with anybody.
Right.
Exchanging money or something and handling money. Nobody knew anything. So we opened for free and we wore masks and we asked visitors to wear masks. And we had, maybe 10,000 visitors. So our visitorship, multiplied on a scale of like 4 or 5 or maybe even more. And it was great. So we sort of had a introduction to a lot of new people, and we started a membership program and are thinking about how to address, larger scale visitorship. But these are all great problems to have.
Totally, when you're doing the work that you've been doing. So just in the last minute or two, then, like fall highlights. So you're open through the end of September, I think, and it's by reservation. And again, I'll give the links for all that. What are we looking forward to coming to see? What are some of the highlights of the later August into September dates?
Well, so, a lot of you mean programmatically or sort of in the garden?
In the garden, yeah. What would I see if I came for a walk? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the unique part of Wethersfield is sort of its formal gardening. We have pleached beach tunnel. We have amazing topiary. There's an aerial hedge of little leaf linden. We have terraces filled with container arrangements. The gardens around the house have historical collections of fuchsia and begonia.
Wow.
And pelargoniums in containers. And I've just been trying to edit the beds to sort of do as much work sort of matching the colors of the fuchsias and the begonias as much as so that we have sort of an overall feeling when you enter these rooms with the rooms that have the flowers. We also have a 190-foot alley of arborvitae that is sort of has an end point of a naiad fountain, which is pretty spectacular, and there's a beautiful rill and some radial steps, and it's just really a very unique garden in America, filled with sort of features that you would tend to see more in Europe than anywhere else in the country.
Yes.
So.
And being lovingly tended back to prime form by you and your team. Toshi Yano, I'm so glad to speak to you, and I'm going to come visit soon. I know that's overdue. But it's great to tell people about this, and thanks for the advice on how to get started with some of our editing and dividing. And I'll talk to you again soon, I hope.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I love your podcast and your newsletter, and it's such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.
Underwriting support by Color Blends Wholesale Flower Bulbs, supplying landscape professionals and ambitious residential gardeners with new ideas and high-quality flower bulbs for fall planting. Plant tulips, plant daffodils, plant Color Blends this fall. Available at colorblends.com.
And thanks to all of you for listening to Now Don't Miss an Episode. You can subscribe free to the podcast version of the show on Stitcher or iTunes or Spotify. And you can find me anytime at awaytogarden.com and on Facebook and Instagram as @awaytogarden. And happy gardening and some dividing and editing meantime.
A Way to Garden with Margaret Roach is a joint production of awaytogarden.com and the smallest NPR station in the nation, Robin Hood Radio.